On December 26, 1900, a relief ship arrived at a lighthouse off the coast of Scotland. 3 men were supposed to be there. Not one of them was. That alone was alarming. But what the relief keeper found next turned a routine crew change into one of the most famous mysteries in maritime history. The lighthouse door was shut. The building was quiet. The men hadn't left a message. They hadn't signaled for help. They had simply vanished. And the strangest part, these were not inexperienced sailors lost in a storm. Their entire job was to stay at the lighthouse, to maintain the light, to watch the sea, to be there. Yet somehow, 3 experienced keepers disappeared from one of the most isolated islands in Britain without leaving behind a single eyewitness. No bodies were ever recovered. No one ever came forward claiming to know what happened. And after more than a century, one crucial piece of the story is still missing. The final few minutes. What happened during those minutes has fueled theories involving giant waves, violence, secret disappearances, and even the supernatural. But before any of those theories existed, there were clues, real clues. And the first one was sitting inside the lighthouse. When the relief keeper entered the station, nothing looked obviously wrong. There were no signs of a struggle, no smashed furniture, no blood, no indication that 3 men had suddenly panicked. In fact, the lighthouse looked surprisingly normal, until one detail stood out. Hanging inside was a set of weather gear. At first, it seemed unimportant. Then someone realized what it meant. One of the missing men had gone outside without it, in the middle of a North Atlantic winter. That single detail immediately created a problem. Experienced lighthouse keepers understood weather better than almost anyone. They knew the risks. They lived with them every day. So why would one of them leave the safety of the station without proper protection? It was the first clue. But it wouldn't be the last. Because the deeper people looked into the disappearance, the more contradictions appeared. Some clues suggested the men had left in a hurry. Others suggested they had time to react. Some pointed toward an accident. Others seemed to challenge it. And then another discovery changed the timeline entirely. A passing ship may have noticed something wrong with the lighthouse nearly 2 weeks before the disappearance was officially discovered. If that report was accurate, investigators had been asking the wrong question all along. The mystery wasn't, what happened on December 26? It was, what happened during the missing days before anyone realized the men were gone? Suddenly, the case became much larger. And before anyone could answer that question, another one emerged. Who exactly were these 3 men? Because the deeper you look into their lives, the stranger the story becomes. One was a respected veteran trusted with a remote station. One was known for documenting details. And one would eventually become the center of a theory that had nothing to do with the sea. But before we get to that, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. Because the next clue wouldn't come from the lighthouse. It would come from a ship passing through the darkness nearly 2 weeks earlier, and it would force investigators to rethink everything they thought they knew about the timeline. The clue came from a merchant ship called the Archtor. On December 15, 1900, the vessel passed near the Flannan Isles. What happened during that voyage wouldn't attract much attention at the time. Years later, it would become one of the most important details in the entire mystery. According to reports, crew members noticed something unusual. The lighthouse light wasn't visible. That may not sound alarming today, but for sailors navigating dangerous waters, a missing lighthouse light was impossible to ignore. The light was supposed to be there, night after night, without fail. Yet on this occasion, something appeared wrong. If the report was accurate, it created a serious problem. The disappearance may not have happened on December 26, when the empty lighthouse was discovered. It may have happened days earlier. Suddenly, investigators weren't dealing with a mystery measured in hours. They were dealing with a mystery measured in days, and every extra day created more questions. If the men vanished before December 15, why didn't anyone notice sooner? If they disappeared after December 15, why was the light reportedly missing? The timeline no longer fit together neatly. And when a timeline breaks, investigators look for something else, the people inside it. The three missing men couldn't have been more different. James Duckett was the principal keeper, trusted, experienced. The kind of man lighthouse authorities relied upon when assigning difficult stations. Thomas Marshall was different. Colleagues knew him as methodical and detail-oriented. He paid attention to things other people overlooked. That detail would become important later, because if something unusual happened on the island, Marshall was exactly the kind of man who might have recorded it. Then there was Donald MacArthur, the temporary replacement, the outsider. Unlike the others, he wasn't permanently assigned to the station. And years later, his name would become attached to one of the most controversial theories in the case. But before that theory emerged, another clue surfaced. This one came from inside the lighthouse itself. Records. The keepers had left behind written entries from the days before they disappeared, and those entries appeared to tell a disturbing story. Powerful winds, rough seas, conditions severe enough to concern experienced men. At first glance, it seemed straightforward. Bad weather, dangerous island, tragic outcome, mystery solved, except one detail refused to cooperate. Decades later, when historians compared those reports with historical weather records, they discovered something unexpected. The wider region wasn't experiencing the kind of extreme conditions many people associated with the disappearance. That didn't prove the records were wrong. Local weather can behave differently, but it introduced another contradiction. The documents appeared to point one way, the weather data pointed another. And now the mystery had two competing versions of reality. One suggested a violent storm. The other suggested something far less dramatic. Then another clue emerged. And unlike the weather reports, this one could be seen. The Western Landing Platform. When people examined the area, they found signs of damage. Equipment had been displaced. Heavy objects appeared to have been moved. Something powerful had struck that section of the island. For the first time, the clues seemed to align. Missing men, bad weather, damaged equipment, a dangerous shoreline. The pieces were beginning to form a picture. But just as that picture started making sense, one detail shattered it. The weather gear. Remember the coat hanging inside the lighthouse? That clue hadn't gone away. In fact, it had become even more important. Because if conditions outside were dangerous enough to damage equipment, why would an experienced keeper walk into them without proper protection? The damaged landing area supported one theory. The abandoned weather gear challenged it. And that contradiction would push the investigation in an entirely new direction. Because the next theory wasn't about storms. It was about one of the missing men himself. And for a time, some people became convinced that whatever happened on the island started not with the sea, but with Donald MacArthur. For years, many people believed the key to the mystery wasn't hidden in the lighthouse. It was hidden in a man, Donald MacArthur. Of the three missing keepers, MacArthur stood out immediately. He wasn't part of the regular crew. He was a temporary replacement, an outsider assigned to one of the most isolated stations in Scotland. And as the story spread, rumors about him began spreading too. Some accounts described him as hot-tempered. Others claimed he had a reputation for getting into arguments. Soon, a new theory emerged. What if the men hadn't been taken by the sea at all? What if something happened inside the lighthouse? At first glance, it sounded possible. 3 men, weeks of isolation, harsh conditions, a disagreement that spiraled out of control. The theory gained traction because it solved several problems at once. It explained why all 3 men disappeared. It explained why nobody returned. And unlike the weather theories, it placed the cause directly inside the lighthouse. For a while, many people found it convincing. Then the theory encountered a problem: evidence. The more closely historians examined the records, the harder it became to support the story. Most of the dramatic claims about MacArthur appeared years after the disappearance. Some appeared decades later. The trail became surprisingly thin. In fact, one of the strangest discoveries in the entire case was that some of its most famous details seemed to become stronger the further they moved away from 1900. The stories grew. The evidence didn't. And suddenly, a theory that looked promising began falling apart. But in the process, another mystery appeared. If the violence theory wasn't supported by evidence, where had it come from? The answer revealed something fascinating. The Flannan Isles mystery wasn't just a disappearance. It was also a story about how mysteries evolve. Every generation added something, a new detail, a new rumor, a new explanation. And some of those additions became so popular that people started treating them as facts. Then another example surfaced, one you've probably heard before: the unfinished meal. According to one famous version of the story, investigators entered the lighthouse and found a meal sitting untouched on the table. The image is unforgettable. 3 men vanish. Dinner remains behind. Time seems frozen. There's only one problem. The evidence for it is surprisingly weak. The deeper historians dug, the harder it became to verify the story. And suddenly, one of the most famous clues in the entire mystery looked far less certain than people believed. That discovery changed everything, because now investigators faced a new challenge, not just solving the disappearance, separating fact from folklore. And once they started doing that, something remarkable happened. The mystery became smaller, but the evidence became stronger. The unfinished meal weakened. The violence theory weakened. Several dramatic stories weakened, yet one clue survived every attempt to dismiss it: the damage near the western landing platform. Heavy equipment had been moved. Structures had been damaged. Something powerful had happened there. And unlike rumors or legends, this clue existed in the physical record. It couldn't simply be explained away. For the first time, attention shifted back toward the island itself, back toward the sea, back toward whatever force had struck that exposed stretch of coastline. Then another question emerged. Not whether the sea was involved, but whether the sea was capable of doing something investigators in 1900 barely understood. Because nearly a century later, scientists would discover that sailors had been right about something all along. And that discovery would completely change how many people viewed the Flannan Isles mystery for centuries. Sailors told stories that sounded impossible. They spoke of waves that appeared out of nowhere. Not ordinary waves, not even storm waves, walls of water rising far above everything around them. Some claimed the waves were as tall as buildings. Others said they struck without warning, even when surrounding seas looked relatively normal. Most people dismissed the stories, including many scientists. The reports sounded exaggerated, like the kind of tales sailors might tell after a long voyage, and for decades there was very little evidence to prove otherwise. Then, in 1995, something happened in the North Sea. An offshore platform called Draupner recorded a wave so large that it shocked researchers. For the first time, instruments had captured direct evidence of what sailors had been describing for generations. The impossible wave wasn't impossible. It was real. Today we call them rogue waves. And suddenly, an old clue from the Flannan Isles looked very different. Because if rogue waves existed, they could explain something that had puzzled investigators from the beginning: the damage at the western landing platform. Remember that clue? Heavy equipment had been moved. Structures had been damaged. Something had struck the island with enormous force. For decades, people argued about what that force might have been. Now there was a new possibility, a possibility supported by science. And for the first time, the accident theory became more than just a theory. But before the mystery could be solved, another detail complicated everything: the location of the damage. Some of it appeared surprisingly high above sea level, high enough that ordinary waves should never have reached it. That detail strengthened the rogue wave explanation, but it also created a disturbing implication. If a wave really reached that height, the keepers may never have had a chance. No warning, no time to escape, no opportunity to return to the lighthouse. Just a few seconds, then silence. It's one of the most haunting possibilities in the entire case. And yet one question still refused to go away. Why were all three men there? The sea might explain how they disappeared. It didn't explain why they were standing in the danger zone in the first place. That question became even more important when historians revisited lighthouse procedures from the period. Normally, at least one keeper remained inside. The system existed for a reason. If something went wrong outside, someone inside could respond. Yet somehow, all three men appear to have ended up in the same dangerous location. Again, the mystery offered an answer, then immediately challenged it. And that's when another possibility emerged. What if the key wasn't the wave itself? What if the key was what happened moments before it arrived? Imagine this. A piece of equipment breaks loose near the landing platform. One keeper notices it. He heads outside. A second follows to help. Then something goes wrong. Now a third man leaves the lighthouse. For the first time, investigators had a sequence that explained why all three might have been outside together. It wasn't perfect, but it worked, at least until another contradiction appeared. Because the more closely people examined the timeline, the stranger it became. Remember the passing ship that may have noticed the lighthouse light missing on December 15. That clue had never been fully explained. In fact, it was about to become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire mystery. Because if the light really was dark on December 15, then some of the most famous parts of the story might not fit at all. And the deeper historians dug into the timeline, the more they realized that several clues people had trusted for decades could be pointing in the wrong direction. The timeline was supposed to help solve the mystery. Instead, it made the mystery worse. For years, many people assumed the disappearance happened shortly before the relief ship arrived on December 26. It seemed reasonable. The lighthouse was found empty. The men were gone. The case began. Simple, except the Archtor report refused to go away. If crew members really failed to see the lighthouse light on December 15, then the keepers may have disappeared much earlier. And if they disappeared earlier, an uncomfortable question followed. How many of the clues people associated with the case were actually based on assumptions? That question led historians down a surprising path. Instead of looking for new evidence, they started re-examining old evidence. And some of the most famous details in the entire story didn't survive the process. Take the dramatic logbook entries. For decades, books and documentaries repeated the same account. One keeper supposedly described terrifying weather. Another entry allegedly spoke of fear and unusual behavior among the men. Then came a final mysterious note, and after that, nothing. It was one of the strongest pieces of evidence supporting the mystery, or so people thought. Then a problem emerged. Researchers began tracing those quotations back to their original source. The trail quickly became confusing. One book referenced another. That book referenced an earlier version. That version referenced an even older account. And somewhere along the way, the original evidence seemed to disappear. The deeper people looked, the harder those famous entries became to verify. Suddenly, one of the most dramatic parts of the story looked less like evidence and more like legend. And it wasn't alone. The unfinished meal, the frightened keeper, the ominous final entries. Again and again, the same pattern appeared. The most dramatic clues often turned out to be the least reliable. That discovery changed the investigation. Because once those stories were stripped away, something remarkable happened. The mystery became simpler, but also stronger. Now the focus returned to the clues that remained. 3 men missing, whether gear left behind, damage near the landing area, no sign of violence, no sign of another vessel, no evidence of escape. The theories began shrinking. One by one, the violence theory weakened. The supernatural theories weakened. The voluntary disappearance theory weakened. And as each explanation fell away, one possibility kept surviving: the sea. Not because it was exciting, because every surviving clue seemed to point back toward it. But before the accident theory could claim victory, it faced one final challenge. A surprisingly powerful one: the absence of bodies. After all, if the sea had taken the men, where were they? It's a question that has kept countless people skeptical, and on the surface, it's a fair question. 3 men don't simply vanish. Or do they? The answer came from looking beyond the lighthouse, beyond the mystery, and into the history of the North Atlantic itself. Because the waters surrounding the Flannan Isles had a long record of swallowing ships, sailors, and fishermen without leaving much behind. Strong currents, violent surf, sharp coastal rocks. In many maritime disasters, recovery never happened. Not because people weren't searched for, because the ocean didn't give them back. That reality didn't prove what happened to the keepers, but it removed one of the strongest arguments against the accident theory. And suddenly, for the first time in the entire investigation, the competing explanations weren't standing on equal ground anymore. One theory was beginning to separate itself from the rest. Yet even then, one haunting question remained. Not how the men died, but what decision placed all 3 of them in the exact same location at the exact same moment. Because if historians are right, the answer to that question may reveal something far more powerful than a mystery. It may reveal who these men really were, and why their story has survived for more than a century when so many others have been forgotten. By this point, most of the famous theories had either weakened or collapsed. The violence theory lacked evidence. The disappearance theory lacked evidence. The supernatural stories lacked evidence. What remained was a much smaller mystery, but in many ways it was a more powerful one. Because now the focus shifted away from speculation and back to the 3 men themselves. And that's where one final clue began to emerge. Not from the lighthouse, not from the weather, from the nature of the job. Think about the question that has followed this story from the beginning. Why were all 3 men outside? It's easy to overlook how important that question is. The accident theory explains what may have happened: a powerful wave, a dangerous shoreline, a tragic chain of events. But it doesn't fully explain why 3 experienced keepers ended up in the same place at the same time. Then historians began looking at lighthouse life more closely, and they discovered something interesting. The answer may have been hiding in plain sight. Lighthouse keeping was built on responsibility. If equipment failed, you fixed it. If a colleague needed help, you helped. If something threatened the station, you responded. That wasn't just procedure, it was culture. The men who worked these remote stations depended on one another, sometimes completely, and suddenly a possible sequence began to emerge. One keeper notices trouble near the landing platform. Maybe a rope has broken loose. Maybe equipment is at risk. Maybe something important is being damaged by the weather. He heads outside. A second keeper follows to help. Then something happens. Now a third keeper leaves the safety of the lighthouse, not because protocol demands it, because people do. If a colleague is in danger, you help. For the first time, the mystery stopped feeling like a puzzle. It started feeling like a human story. And that possibility matters because it changes how we view the disappearance. For decades, many people searched for something extraordinary, a secret, a conspiracy, a hidden explanation. But what if the truth was ordinary? Not ordinary in the sense of common, ordinary in the sense of human, duty, responsibility, instinct. 3 men making decisions that countless others would have made in the same situation. The more researchers compared the Flannan Isles case with other maritime accidents, the more familiar the pattern became. Danger appears, people respond, events unfold faster than expected. And afterward, observers are left wondering why better choices weren't made. But that's the advantage of hindsight. The keepers didn't know how the story would end. They only knew what was happening in front of them. And if the leading theory is correct, they had only seconds to react. That's one reason the mystery has endured. Not because the evidence points in every direction, because the evidence points in one direction while leaving one critical moment hidden from view. A gap of minutes, maybe less. Everything before that gap can be studied. Everything after it can be inferred. The gap itself remains empty. And yet, something surprising happened as historians continued examining the case. The less mysterious it became, the more meaningful it became. Because eventually the story stopped being about how the men disappeared. It became about why people still cared. Hundreds of maritime accidents have been forgotten. Thousands of sailors have vanished from historical memory. So why did these three men remain? The answer has less to do with the mystery itself, and more to do with what the mystery preserved. A lost profession, a forgotten way of life, and three ordinary men whose final act may have been an attempt to help one another. But the strangest part is this. If the disappearance had never happened, most people today would never know their names. Instead, more than a century later, James Duckett, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur are still remembered. And that may be the final twist in the entire story, because the mystery that took them from history is the very thing that kept them in it. And that brings us to the last question. After 125 years of investigation, theories, clues, and contradictions, what can we honestly say happened on the Flannan Isles? And just as importantly, what can we never know? After more than a century, thousands of pages of investigation, and countless theories, we're left with a surprisingly simple conclusion. The most likely answer is also the least dramatic. The sea probably took them, not a secret society, not a supernatural force, not a violent confrontation inside the lighthouse, just the Atlantic Ocean, relentless, unpredictable, and far more powerful than the three men standing against it. But notice something. I said most likely, not certain, because certainty is the one thing this mystery never provided. We know the lighthouse was found empty. We know the men disappeared. We know damage existed near the western landing area. We know one set of weather gear remained behind. We know no convincing evidence of violence, escape, or outside involvement was ever found. And when all those clues are placed side by side, they point in the same direction. Yet one crucial piece is still missing. The moment itself, the final decision, the final warning, the final seconds. Those disappeared with James Duckett, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur. And that missing moment may be the reason people still talk about this case today. Because the mystery isn't built on dozens of unanswered questions anymore. It's built on one, just one. What happened during those final minutes? Maybe a rope broke loose. Maybe equipment was in danger. Maybe one man went outside and the others followed. Maybe a massive wave struck before anyone understood the danger. It's a reconstruction, a reasonable one, but still a reconstruction. And that's where the story quietly shifts from mystery to history. Because eventually, every investigation reaches a point where evidence ends. The Flannan Isles case reached that point long ago. What survives now are the facts. 3 men vanished. 3 families never received complete answers. And one remote lighthouse became part of maritime history forever. Ironically, the mystery itself may have hidden the most remarkable part of the story. The men. For decades, books focused on theories. Documentaries focused on clues. Writers focused on contradictions. But behind every theory stood 3 real people. James Duckett, the veteran trusted to run an isolated station. Thomas Marshall, the careful observer whose name became attached to some of the most debated records in the case. Donald MacArthur, the temporary replacement who was transformed into a legend by stories that may never have been true. They weren't characters in a mystery when they arrived on the island. They were workers, doing a difficult job, in a dangerous place. And perhaps that's why the story has lasted, not because it offers endless mystery, because it offers just enough mystery, enough to keep people searching, enough to keep people asking questions, enough to ensure the men themselves were never forgotten. Before we finish, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. It's always fascinating to see how stories from a tiny Scottish island continue reaching people all over the world. And if you've enjoyed this journey into one of history's most enduring maritime mysteries, consider subscribing so you don't miss future stories. Because the past is full of unanswered questions, but it's also full of people. People who built, explored, survived, discovered, and sometimes disappeared, leaving behind only fragments of their story. The three keepers of the Flannan Isles left behind one of those fragments: a lighthouse, a handful of clues, a century of debate, and one final unanswered question hanging over the Atlantic. When the light went dark, what really happened on that island? We may never know, but thanks to the records they left behind and the mystery that followed, we're still asking. And perhaps that's why their story continues to echo across history today.